But we have so much positivity here in the meetup that we always get people, so we should have more. So this meetup is actually a user group of Scrum Alliance as well. So we've got for about 2 years now, we've been part of the users group of the, what is that called, Scrum Alliance. And what it means is if you are CSP, which is a certification, you can get your SEUs, which means your educational units, for your renewal of your certification by attending this event. And you get 2 SEUs to attend this. If you are a PMI affiliate, and if you are a PMP, PMI ACP, or whatever PMI, then you get 2 PDUs, which is the professional development units, coming here, and for free, and with some good food. This forum is yours. We have been changing this forum as we get more and more feedback from you, and that's the reason you see that Starfish retrospective there. I started calling it Starfish, not the web, because some people flip out with with the webs. So that's a Starfish retrospective. So whenever you get a chance, during the break, at the end of the meeting, whenever, get up, put a sticky on how do we improve that. What do we start doing? What do we stop doing? What do we do more? What do we do less? What do we continue doing? Sometimes it's important to know what should we continue. Is something really going on well? Then I need to know so that we don't change it. And then there are some takeaways there. So we have a very good featured speaker tonight. We're going to get a lot of takeaways. But if each one of us have a couple of takeaways, and if we share that with the community here, and the community outside who didn't attend or couldn't come here or couldn't reach, a picture of that will be posted on the event, so everyone can benefit of what that takeaway was, and maybe it's a great help for people's professional growth. That's a great thing. The other thing that I see there is trainings offered. So we have Steve and Mark, they're brothers by the way, and they're so they have Steve has some trainings lined up here, and there's a special code which gives us $300 discount. So is the training for $1 now?
No, it becomes, they're 2 days each, but it becomes the early bird price.
Oh, that's great. Cool. So avail that opportunity. Just because you're here, you can get some professional trainings with some great discounts there. You also have job services there, whatever you want to call it. But if you're a job seeker, paste or just use a sticky note again with your name and contact details. So great. So with that, we have a featured speaker. So this featured speaker, Sam has been a great speaker. He has gone and spoken at several different places, but where we tapped him is at the Agile camp. He was a speaker there, and people loved him talk there, and we wanted to leverage that and make sure we have him here, and he gracefully agreed. His forte is all about lean on Agile. So that's really great, because Agile is already lean, right? But here we are talking about combining both, and boy, that becomes really, really powerful. And I'm super excited to have him here. With that, I'd like to introduce Sam McAfee. Welcome.
Check. How's that? Okay. So I've prepared this talk around the schedule tonight. We've got one section, and then there's a break with some activities, and then there's a second section. So the first part of the talk is really going to be somewhat theoretical and historical, and in the second half we're going to get much more tactical. And I also have a couple of fun little exercises for us to do together. So hopefully that'll be both educational and entertaining. But the first thing I should do is probably give you a little bit of background on myself. So there's a little bit about me. I don't know why I needed to put a picture up there because you can see me right here, but for someone seeing the slides somewhere else. I'm kind of a startup guy. I have an engineering background, and I've been in the tech scene here in Silicon Valley for almost 20 years. And I started as an engineer. I was a web developer in the .com boom. I didn't have a technical background originally. I actually hailed from the social sciences, but when I came out here to the Bay Area, that's kind of what was happening, and so I got into technology kind of sideways. I was here with a bunch of friends, and they were all engineers, and they were all working in this .com boom. And so, you know, I was the one poor guy that was always borrowing money for pizza from all my friends. And, you know, if you could just learn some HTML, you could get a job like that, and then you stop borrowing money from us. So embarrassed. I said, all right, I should probably be economically self-sufficient in my early 20s. And I went and got a book on Webmaster in a Nutshell, that old O'Reilly book. And I took a picture of myself holding the book and put it on Craigslist. And the next day I got like 50 jobs. That's kind of how it was in those days. I'm exaggerating, but only just. So I started doing freelance web development, and eventually that sort of merged into building a small team, and kind of developed a little bit of an organic web development agency, and did lots of consulting and lots of working with different teams and companies over the years. And I was an early proponent of Agile, because when I was looking around, by the time my team had sort of started to grow, it was the early 2000s, and I was looking for a process, that's what was coming up at the top of the search results. So maybe a few years earlier, I might have found some different answers when I started to look for how do you run a software project. But my career has developed kind of in tandem with Agile itself. So for me, it's always just been the way that we work. It feels very natural. As we mentioned, I've had a lot of startup experiences sort of along the way, in and out of different startups, sometimes as a co-founder, sometimes as an early engineering person, in a small team. And I certainly learned it the hard way. And more recently, I've done more, in the last few years, I've been more involved in doing coaching of product and technical teams at large organizations that are trying to learn how to do product development like a startup. So it's a little bit of a different world for me, kind of trying to take my startup scrappy background and translate it over into the corporate world is an interesting challenge, and one that I'm learning a lot from every day. And then the last couple of years I spent writing this book that I just finished in December called Startup Patterns. I was working at a consulting company, Neo, 2 years ago, and a bunch of us formed a little book writing group. So we sort of peer pressured each other into writing a book. So this is the result of that initial group. So I owe those guys a lot for getting me to finally do this. So let's get into the details. One more shameless plug just before I dive in. So this is what I'm doing now. I just in this year started, in the last 10 months or so, got together with a couple of partners to try to build a company around this idea of bringing startup techniques to big companies. So basically we're bringing a method of developing spin-up, easy pop-up incubators for organizations, where we try to teach the methods that I've learned over the years to companies that are trying to be more agile and more lean at scale. So that's kind of what I'm up to. So check out Blackwillow. But I want to get into a little bit of the background of Agile and Lean, because I think it's really interesting. And I'm a proponent in teaching these methods that I'm definitely a process nerd for sure, but I think it's really important to understand the core principles behind things. A lot of people are looking for answers to their problems in a particular context, and sort of like ask, what's the process for this, and what's the process for that, or give me some best practices. And in my experience, I found it to be much more valuable for a team or an organization to learn the principles and to develop their own custom solution to their problem based on the principles. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a lightning background of where all this stuff comes from and why it's so closely related. And I think if you don't know this history already, you find it interesting. And if you do, you might see a tidbit or two you didn't know already. So a lot of it dates back to this guy. And this is W. Edwards Deming. And Deming basically was sort of a statistical nerd who came up in the Depression era. And he had the opportunity of working with his mentor, Dr. Short, at Bell Labs. And he's got a couple of interesting sort of claims to fame. So one of them is that he and Schuhart were sort of the first to develop statistical methods for quality control, right? So like doing sampling, for example. So you may not know this, but the census actually used to be collected by person through the Postal Service, right? So they didn't always do statistical sampling, and it was painful and error-prone. And these guys are at least partially credited with figuring out that you can use statistical sampling to do a census calculation much faster and much more accurate. Right? So Deming got really good at using statistical methods to improve production processes. Right? So he went from the agricultural department into the war effort during World War II and worked in, as a consultant, basically helping the production facilities to improve the quality of their output. And he was so good at that when the war was over, he was sent to Japan to work with scientists and engineers in Japan on the rebuilding effort there. And he befriended a number of people, and there was a collaboration formed with Japanese industry and Japanese scientists and engineers around using both the statistical methods and also an iterative process of trying something and then checking the results and then making a change and going around this cycle. So from my perspective, Deming's really the first one who came up with this idea of doing an iterative cycle on development and quality control. Right? So fast forward a little bit, we have this guy, Taiichi Ohno, who sort of came up out of that reconstruction effort in Japan and is credited with inventing the Toyota production system that many of us know and have heard of. I don't know the exact details of the collaboration with Deming, but I know they were all kind of floating around the same circles more or less at the same time. And the Toyota production system is also a really foundational piece at the root of both Lean and Agile, and I'll show you how in a second. So a lot of what we do in Agile comes out of principles that were developed from the Toyota production system. We'll go into detail on that in a second. So moving along, at some point in the 80s, this lean thinking found its way to the United States. So just from an economic perspective, and I told you I hail from the social sciences, right? So after World War II, as we all know, the United States was in a very strong production situation, and our sort of golden years of the 50s and 60s in output was really based on having virtually no foreign competition, right? But by the 70s, by the late 60s and early 70s, German and Japanese manufacturing had come back with a vengeance, and so now there was intense competition with US manufacturers. And one of the things that happened was that by the 80s, companies started looking around for ways to improve production, started looking to Japan for solutions, right? So eventually, this guy, John Krafchick, wrote an article, I believe it was in Time magazine, where he talked about this lean production system that we were bringing over from Japan. And he's really the guy that coined that term, and so it stuck. So now we're dealing with lean manufacturing in the United States, starting to spread, becoming sort of a standard, at least in the manufacturing world. Now, fast forward a little bit to the mid-90s. This is Kent Beck. It's not a great picture, but I had to pick it because it was so ridiculous. I apologize for the resolution. He's actually a hero of mine, but I picked the most embarrassing picture I could. So if Ken never sees this video, sorry, Ken. So Scrum and extreme programming are two methodologies that we associate with the beginning of Agile. So as the story goes, Jeff Sutherland, who's the father of the Scrum method, along with Coach Robert, actually read an article about Japanese manufacturing in Harvard Business Review. and was inspired by the description of that team, I think it was at Toshiba, as a Scrum team. And that was sort of where he got the idea for the name. That might be a myth, but I've read that story in multiple places, so I think it's probably true. But in any case, it sort of shows that there's this lineage already existing between sort of traditional lean with Agile. So, and if you take a look at the Extreme Programming book as well, the first edition, Kenneth Beck wrote himself, is fairly technical. The second edition, where he had, I believe, writing and editing help from his wife, and is much better, also includes a lot of lean material around the organization and lean principles. So there's sort of an adjustment to the version of the book that I thought was interesting. So you have Agile kind of growing up out of lean here. And then finally, another big sort of milestone for me in Agile's history is the introduction of the Kanban method. So I'm not sure exactly when, but I think in the early 2000s or late 90s. 2004? Okay, so David Anderson developed this idea of using some of these other concepts from Toyota and from the theory of constraints and a few other places to develop this flow version of what was being done in Agile. Because there are a lot of really important lessons from this Kanban method that you guys can apply. Actually, this training that Steve is doing is all about that Kanban method. And that's something I believe in very strongly. So, up to this point, Agile's impact has been pretty significant, right? So it really leads to much more stable and reliable software. The software, it works, it's less buggy, you can produce it faster, it gets more of what the users want. The engineering practices around Agile have improved dramatically, test-driven development, continuous integration, things like that. But there's still something missing. And for me, that something missing is manifested in the story that I've written a lot of code in my 20 years so far, and much of it has never been used by okay, so I don't know if anyone else has had that experience, but the idea of building software that is expertly crafted, perfectly designed and architected, that is not what the market wants, is essentially waste. Right? So along comes this guy. So Eric Ries, author of Lean Startup, kind of put an interesting market-focused spin on the existing Lean and Agile stuff that was already out there. And what he basically came up with, influenced by Steve Blank, his mentor, was this idea that you should be building technology that people actually want. Right? So Lean Startup is all about finding a real painful problem for really existing users and a sizable, reachable market. And that's what we're here to do in terms of building software products for customers. Right? So you have solving real problems, reducing bigger risks into smaller risks, which I think is very, also associated with Agile. You've got this iterative process again of going through just like we have sprints in Scrum and in XP, this idea of iterating with the market. So you have your build and your measure and your learn loop, right? So going around that loop. And then using data, using feedback from customers and from users to inform the process and fold it back. Right? So this is something that Agilists are used to that idea in terms of users. Where Lean Startup puts a little tweak on it is we often think in terms of, certainly in terms of Scrum, that there's an assumption that the product owner is there to define the product. The product owner is sort of speaking for the market. This kind of challenges that assumption. So I have met a lot of product owners in my career. Very few of them really know what the market wants. And so it's important to get them out of the building and actually ask them. So the way that Lean Startup works is that rather than listing out the requirements for a software product as a set of user stories first, we're basically testing assumptions that we have about users and their needs and their wants. So we construct those more as hypotheses to be tested. So the first rule is admitting that we don't actually know what to build until we go and test it. That's a really important part. The other idea is that we're emphasizing learning over just building things. This is an idea that's really challenging to a lot of organizations that are focused on primarily on utilization of individual players on the team, right? So there are multiple reasons why utilization isn't the best measure of team development in general. Throughput is another one that's more related to Kanban. But certainly this idea of, as a product development team, we're there to learn from the market and from our environment. And so this whole idea of doing these minimal viable products is not just to reduce risk, but to actually learn something about the market and bring that back into the next round of development. Right? It's all about becoming an organization that's able to be aware of market conditions and adapt to those conditions as quickly as possible. And then finally, you've got this focus on metrics. So the metrics are definitely things in terms of our development speed, velocity or cycle time, depending on whether it's Scrum or Kanban, but also metrics from the product's usage in the market as well. So acquisition metrics, and activation and retention of users, revenue metrics, and referral and virality. Those kinds of things become very important because this situates an agile product development process in a situation where you're actually bringing things to market and getting feedback from the users so that you know that you're building the right thing. It's very important. All right, so a quick aside. I mentioned Lean and Lean Startup, and a lot of people that I talk to get them confused, so I made this slide just to sort of clarify this. So Lean, as we talked about in the beginning, Lean is associated more with the optimization in the production process. Right? So that's where the Toyota production system, a lot of that theory comes from the throughput through a system, right? And optimizing the whole system. Lean Startup is sort of derived from that philosophy, but it's more about using the market as your testing ground. So just to kind of clarify those two things. All right, so now we're going to have a little bit of fun just before the break. So I'm going to ask you to do an exercise together as groups. Okay? So we've got some white paper here. Perhaps we could find everyone with a sheet of white paper in their hands. We all have pens. I'm going to teach you how to do a persona the lean way, the lean startup way that I need you to do. So first, let me tell you, as we're getting the paper around, let's think about what a persona is, right? So remember I mentioned that the good product is solving a real painful problem for a really existing customer segment in a sizable, reachable market. If you don't have any one of those elements, you don't have a successful product, and you might as well stop it. Right? So one of the things that I do with people that I work with, when I'm coaching teams or when I'm an incubator or in a startup myself, we start with testing the customers before we start writing code. And I'm actually working with some teams right now where I've got engineers that are very skilled, very expensive engineers, and I have them running around doing customer interviews. And I occasionally get the question of, I gave you these engineers for this project, why are they not writing code? And so my snarky response is, well, I could certainly have them writing code, but we don't know what code they're writing. So it would kind of be wasteful for me to just have them writing any old code. We're trying to go out and find out what we should be building. And the reason why the engineer is doing it himself is because as a team, I want them all to learn how to build empathy with the customer. So this exercise of doing a persona is all about building empathy with the customer. So the way that I learned how to do this is from Janice Frazier, who's another sort of lean startup pro in my industry. I had the pleasure of working with her for a little while. Janice taught me how to do personas in a particular way. So the first thing that you do is you divide your page into 4 quadrants. Fold it, line, there's going to be 4 spaces on this page. And the first part of the page is going to be a sketch up in the upper corner. Right? So what we're doing here is we're designing a user for a product. I'm going to tell you what the product is, just so we're all doing the same thing. Let's do a task management tool for say, program managers or project managers or something like that. So we're going to develop a persona, and the persona is basically a fictional person who is very, very sort of indicative of users you might actually run into, right? So the first thing you want to do is in the upper corner, and I'll do one, you want to give this person a name, okay? What we're doing is I'm tapping into the creative side of your brain. So I'm making you come up with a name, and I'm making you draw a picture. Because I have Sally here. Sally's going to be my user, right? So you give the person a name, and then you draw yourself a little sketch of this user, right? And the reason why I'm going to have you draw is because, again, this isn't all about the left brain, right? I mean, this isn't all about the analytical side. This is my very simple sketch of Sally, our user. I could certainly elaborate. One of my colleagues, Tristan Cromer, has a great sort of sketching workshop he does that really gets people comfortable with the idea of doing stick figures and stuff. We don't really have time for that, but I want you to draw a little sketch of your user, right? So that's the first quadrant. I'll give you a minute to do that. It doesn't have to be complicated. You could give your user some hair, you could give them a hat, you could draw something in the background, a window, a landscape, maybe put a cell phone in their hand, whatever, something to kind of enrich the picture. Right? So what you're trying to do is you're building empathy with a user that you imagine. Right? Now, these are typically done, by the way, after you've done a little bit of initial work. Like, we're all in a startup, right? So we're working on our task management startup. Presumably, we've poked around and did some research. We have some idea of what these program managers are all about. Right? Like, we have some idea of the kinds of things that they do. So the other 4 quadrants are going to be data. We're going to write some words in each one. And so the way that I learned to do this is in the quadrant next to the picture, we write some demographic information. So I put demographics at the top, and then I make a list of a couple of things, just a few bullet points of how this user, things that we would want to know about them as pertains to this task management. So like, this user lives in an urban area. Right? Let's see, this user is, you give them an age, perhaps, if it's relevant. You might say they have an MBA, if it's relevant. Like, you think of demographics that are appropriate to the problem. You might not say that they're blonde because we don't care. Like, so there's this ferreting out of a few specific demographics that really make this person appear real. And you don't use ranges, right? We're not going to say 35 to 40. We're going to say, this is Sally, she's 36, she lives in an urban area, she has a car, like those kinds of things, right? So this demographic data is just enriching this profile. And it's all hypothetical, but it's based on some research that we would have already done with a reasonable idea of the target market we're trying to hit. And after you put some demographics in, the next thing that you're going to do is in the quadrant below the picture, we're going to write out some behaviors, okay? So these first demographics, those are mostly properties or nouns, right, or sort of descriptive adjectives, descriptive characteristics. So not really nouns. But the behaviors are going to be things that this character does in their day-to-day life that are going to be relevant to this product that we're building. So for me, it might be spends a lot of time on the BART, or something like that. So maybe I'm hinting at like a mobile app might be a possible solution. Now granted, I'm not committing to a mobile app yet. I'm just saying, there are some possible solutions that might be driven by the behaviors, right? Doesn't have a lot of time, right? Like that sort of thing. So you're dragging out these behaviors that might be relevant to the product. And then in the final box, in the lower left, we write a series of problems, okay? And we have another exercise we're going to do later where these problems are going to come into play. So problems, I want you to push yourself to try to come up with 2 or 3, are things that this user finds frustrating or is stuck with that in the back of our mind we know we might be able to build a solution for. Now your problem statement does not have an app that we're going to build. That's not their problem. Right? The problem is not an inverse of the solution. Right? The problem is something about the way that they work or their environment or where they are that's actually relevant. Something we think about. This program manager has trouble knowing which task is the most important in the middle of the meeting, or something like that. You know, those kinds of things that might be related to it. You know, don't push too hard because we're not really building anything, so you won't really use these. I'm just trying to illustrate how to do it. And when you're done with that, I would love it. Well, I'm just going to grab a volunteer. So you can either volunteer or I'll pick someone to just stand up really quickly and share your persona. Right. Is anyone done with your problem statements? You put your pen down. Does anyone want to volunteer to share? You want to do it? Sure. Okay. So then you two, you can go next. And we'll do this with you. So why don't you take your persona, stand up, show it around, show your beautiful picture.
All right.
Does it feel like kindergarten again? Yeah, I do too.
Hi, my name's Scott. My persona is Millicent, and she's 48. She went to City College. She has 6 certifications. She drives a Prius. One of her behaviors is when she goes on vacation, she plans it out to 10-minute increments. So she's very precise. Her problem is she has lots of meetings. She needs to assign tasks while actually in the meeting. She needs a dashboard for e-staff. And she has to make custom reports for lots of different stakeholders. Well, thank you.
Yeah, I think the one piece of feedback that I would give is, and that's very good, a dashboard is a solution. So, or maybe it's not, but I think I would be I would sort of probe a little further to what's sort of the problem behind that. Like, it needs to see everything in one place or something like that. So be careful about slipping into the solution zone. Why don't you share yours for us? And I think we're almost ready for the break.
Hi, my name is Prashanti. So my persona is the little small guy, Nick, right here.
Tiny.
Yeah. So basically, he's a fresh MBA graduate. He just started into program management. He's a program manager in the city. So his characteristics or behaviors is he spends too much time on meetings, but he's very impatient to send the meeting notes or send you need to communicate same information to multiple stakeholders, right? So he's very impatient to do that. So his problem is he needs a one-stop solution where he can feed all the notes and then he can generate different kinds of reports using the same data.
Very cool.
And he needs everything to be faster. He doesn't want to spend too much time on the typical program management tools.
Excellent, excellent. That's great. Does anyone else want to share one? Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Smita. My persona is Sapukutan, just a fictional name. He lives in urban or suburban, in the border. He's a postgraduate. He's very picky and looks for quality in everything. And he likes fast sports cars, very expensive ones. Behavioral characters, flips jobs. He is a wine enthusiast. He is very adventurous. Problems are he has trouble staying loyal to what he picks. And he needs something that's really flashy to be impressed.
All right. Any others? Go for it.
I don't know if you can see my picture. I just drew a picture of Bob. He looks a lot like Bill the Cat, if you've ever seen Bloom County. Bob is mid-career, planner, he's organized, but he has far more responsibility than he has authority. Drive a simple, reliable car because that's the way he wants his life to be, but unfortunately, he also travels a lot to visit customers and teams, so he's often mobile. He needs to regularly report status and progress, not only to the people above him to manage up, but across to other teams so they know cross dependencies and things like that. And he, like everybody else, has trouble estimating completion dates. His biggest problems are concurrency of information, prioritizing his difficulties, prioritizing things to get done, and communications, both up, across, and within teams.
All right, great, thank you. Thanks for participating in this. So what I typically do with these, this is a way of basically understanding our customer. Right? So these are the people that we're going to try to sell this tool to, or they'll be the users, and we'll try to sell it to the employer. There'll be some business model associated with it. So the next thing that we would typically do, we're going to play around with this a little later, is our list of problems that we have. If we were actually on a team, let's say a bunch of us are on a software team, and we sort of do this exercise together, we would consolidate all of our problem statements, and we would try to sort of stack rank them to what we thought would be most likely. But they're just hypotheses. We don't really know, right? And we don't know which ones are more or less important. So what we would next do is we would go and try to find a bunch of people like this, and we would do interviews with them. And the interviews are designed in such a way that we would give them the problem statements that we end up with. And they would tell us whether or not they have that problem at all, and if they do have the problem, how painful it is. And the reason why the pain is important is because you might find that a wide range of the people you interview actually have problem A, but it's not painful enough for them to incur any switching costs to some other solution, right? Like everyone has this problem, but it's like, it's no big deal, right? But if you find a problem that's extraordinarily painful, and you can use this series of interviews, you can interview not a huge number of people, 20, 30 people, and start to get a signal from the market. And when people ask, like, well, how many people do you usually interview for problem interviews? I use 20 as sort of a round number, but the real truth is you can stop interviewing when you can guess what the next interviewee is going to say. Right? So this is all about learning. Right? So once we've got to the point where we're starting to prove that of the people sampled, certain problems rise to the top above others, that then gives us a ranked list of our most important problems to build this solution. Right? So what would happen if we didn't do this, and we just had our problems on a persona, and we went out into the world with a product that was built for what we thought the most important problems, right? And if we got that problem I mentioned earlier, if that was our top problem, but it wasn't that painful for enough people, and we didn't know that, we would spend all this time building this product to solve a problem, and people would not really need to use it, right? Or they're like, my spreadsheet's fine, right? Like, this is a pain, but it's not that big a problem, so I'm not going to switch, right? So it's really important to find a really painful problem for a really existing customer segment in a sizable, reachable market. And that last bit, sizable, reachable, is basically because if we're trying to build a business here, we need more than a handful of customers. So there are other tests and exercises that we can do to find market size and that sort of thing. So I had a slide here that says break time. It doesn't have to be break time. We can do break time. This is the right time.
Do break time.
All right, let's do break time.
Cool.
All right. Thanks much.
All right. So
See you.
great topic. So as Sam mentioned, he has 10 copies of this book tonight. We're going to have 2 raffles, okay, and 8 are for book signing. If you're interested to get the book signed from him and buy that book, you can always see him during the break, after the event, and so on. But there will be 2 raffle books. So if you have a card, you can put the card in here, or if you don't, it's okay. There's great sticky notes. Pick your color and put your name down here. and you have to be present to win the raffle. And so this is that book, in reality. This is that book we will raffle out. And I have a familiar name on that. Sam. All right. Thank you. So the very first lightning talk we have is by Steve Fickey.
Apply in ways that people end up having some problems with.
All right. Hi. So, Scrum works. You know, I'm known for, I like to talk about Kanban a lot, but Scrum works. Everywhere I go, people are using Scrum. One thing that I have come into, especially with the financial companies, but I think it would be anywhere. I work with financial companies, but a problem that I see is that the practices and the structure behind Scrum is just being applied in ways that people end up having some problems with. And there's a concept of being fit for purpose that I think that some people can, in fact you guys were just talking about that people try to apply something because that's the way you're supposed to do it, but it doesn't quite give you the results you're trying to get. And the thing I like to remember is that the last ceremony within Scrum, you guys remember what that is? Yeah, what happens in that? You review how do things go, and you may, like that starfish over there, you may decide to do things a little bit better, which means differently. So, end of the first sprint, you may not be doing Scrum. You might be doing Scrum, but at the end of the first sprint by design. But anyway, the reason I brought this up is one of the things that I come across kind of relatively often is this concept of teams and people thinking that we need everybody in the team in order to be able to make decisions and move the work through and get it done. And one of the principles of teams that I've found is that by definition, people in a team, they should be able to share work. So if you're an Android developer, can you do the iOS developer's task? Can you write that code and make sure it works in the test? Is that a challenge? Is that hard to do? Or if you're, yeah, so here's another one. You're a UX expert, like you. How many Scrum teams out there have a dedicated UX expert? Anybody here have that happen? A couple. So, well, yeah, you do. But are you prepared to argue for that budget? You get a UX person per team. So often that's a shared resource. So my recommendation is, I don't have all the solutions for it, but my recommendation is to look into, looking at teams, forming them around some of their competencies, especially if you already have shared resources, kind of sequestered away from the teams. But then also if you have a team where work is sort of stagnating because it doesn't really pass amongst the team members, you might want to split those teams up and combinize the way the work flows through them. You can look it up on Google very quickly and find out what that means. So now it's time for a pitch.
Go for it.
So, doing a training in March. Details are up there, but or like the how to do it is up there. But I want to explain them a little bit. So there's two-day trainings that are a part of getting a Kanban Management Professional designation, a KMP. So if you see that as one of the acronyms at the bottom of the job description, that's what a KMP means. The first one is Kanban Systems Design. What that is, it's day one. It's a simulation. It's the best way for people to see how it all works, because it's pretty complex, and how it all fits together. Get it through that simulation. It's actually quite a sophisticated board game. Second day is static. So as a participant, you apply the Kanban method to your work. So if you're not working, you can kind of learn the concept of what that would be like, but it's better to actually have work, bring it there, and apply Kanban to it. And then you can go back and implement that. The second one is the Kanban Management Professional Training. That's like, so there's some training on how to be the internal change agent. using an evolutionary process to scale this change and scale the Kanbanization. The agilization, but Kanban is just a name, the Kanbanization of your workflows and the other workflows that other people are doing. It teaches improvement models, so that's part of the continuous improvement. And the other big part is the formal feedback loops. So that's where the scale of Kanban comes from, is through the feedback loop system. We call it cadences. There's a third one that's specifically tailored for product management. And what that is, it's one of the missing elements from the Kanban management professional training, the second training. One of the elements from the feedback loops that's missing is in the day 5, the product management training. And so that's about strategically thinking of your products so that you can break it up and like feed it to different teams. And the other part is demand shaping. The purpose of this is to be able to take a roadmap, like a strategy. It comes from your board, it comes from some smart person, it comes from like a team of smart people validating product ideas, and turning it into digestible epics, user stories that you can feed to lots of teams. Everything in between there, and making the decisions on like, so specifically what are we going to do, and why do we know this is the right choice? That's what's in the day 5 course. So if you have any questions about it, you can ask me, or you can just look it up. This is certified training from the Lean Kanban University, and they have more information about what that stuff is. Thanks. Cool. Oh, sorry. Next month, I'm also going to be doing the Agile Camp talk. That's kind of a case study, but we can't say who it was anymore. So.
Right. So he's our guest speaker next month.
Yes.
The second person here is Prashanti, and her topic is lean waste. Prashanti, your time starts now.
Hi, my name is Prashanti. I'm project manager Visa. So when I came here, I was not prepared to give any lightning talk, but I was thinking of what topic to give, and I figured out that there are some hours left. So since we are talking about lean, I just wanted to emphasize some improvements which we are trying to do in our organization with our teams. So as you all know, one of the lean software principles, the key principle is eliminating waste. So what we are heading towards with our organization for this year is we want to move fast. We want to get more products to market sooner. And we are trying to retrospect in terms of what is hindering us in terms of getting things done faster. As we are a financial organization, things are very different. We need to cater to certain processes. It's not something like we should give stability and security because it's a financial domain, and with all the hackers being smart, we should be really, really careful. So we did some introspection in terms of how to deliver things faster. So here is what 2 things which we are doing in our teams moving forward. So the first waste we discussed is teams are waiting a lot. So the developers who have to actually do the coding, they're actually wasting a lot of time in waiting. So one of the reasons is we see a lot of issues in terms of the developers setup and things like that. So we're actively working with the respective teams to make sure the developers have the right tools so that they can focus entirely on delivering the products faster. The second thing is we do have a lot of processes, like we are trying to figure out, like Margaret here, who is going to give the next speech, like a lot of people like Margaret, they are bringing an initiative called Make It Easy, Life Easy. So we are bringing a lot of things to the organization to make the developers or the employees' life easy. So that's one of the things. So the key goal, we are an agile shop, but what we are trying to do is we are trying to focus on eliminating waste for a couple of months to see how we can get that velocity, execution velocity faster.
Nice. And the third topic is Stories to Drive Change by Margaret. And Margaret is the champion for this meetup as well. Because of her, we get the sponsorship to do the meetup right here. So thank you so much, Margaret.
Thank you to Anu for being a wonderful facilitator. here. So I'm Margaret Montana, Stories to Drive Change. 2.5 years ago, over the 4th of July weekend, it was horrible. I was up late at night on my computer. My eyes were just losing it because it was me in Excel. I was working literally 10-hour days with Excel and wrestling with HR data in Excel. And I love Excel, I gotta tell you, but I don't love it that much. And I definitely don't love it on 4th of July weekend. So how did I get in this mess and how did I get out? Well, I and my team are responsible for many things, as Prasanthi said, and one of them is workforce plan, which is not very exciting, but it turns out to be very important. And what we did to change it is wrote stories. So writing user stories actually changed our life and is helping to change parts of the Make It Easier story in Visa. And I want to explain how that worked, because it almost sounds too good to be true, right? How could this help? I first want to give a little bit of a shout out to Keith Ray. Where is Keith? Keith here. Yes, because Keith is the one who first told me about user stories. I had no idea. I worked with him a very long time ago, and he was the very first person who was inside a company trying to get people to do extreme programming, and I was managing a team at the time of technical product owners, or technical, they weren't called technical product owners, but they were that role, you know, kind of technical product managers. So anyway, thank you to Keith. Now my story, this is what I did. I said, this is horrible, I'm pulling my hair out, but I can either be part of the problem or I can be part of the solution. And so I set up a series of 6 meetings with 60 stakeholders across all of Visa. And I invited them, I said, just come to one of these. And I put sticky notes on the table, and I put, I'll say persona names, but real names, as a technical product manager, as a project manager, as a whatever, and I said, just tell me what you need, what's frustrating, what's not working, and I just gathered all this data on all these sticky notes, and then created user stories. And then I shopped this around. I said, this is the problem, this is the vision, these are the user stories as a, I need, so that, and I sent it to many, many influential people across Visa. And I would like to tell you that it's 100% solved, and it's not, but a lot of the pain points are solved. And now, I'm using the exact same format in other problem areas inside of Visa, and identifying stakeholders, gathering data, making it into user stories. So we're making hashtag Make It Easier into kind of a product. That's my story.
Thank you so much, all 3 of you. Things over there are looking very sad, but I hope you get some time to write some takeaways and retrospectives. We'll talk about that right after we end our presentation. So back to you, Stan. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay. Great. And we're back. So I also really want to thank you for the lightning talks. I know those are really interesting, and all 3 are topics that I'm also really passionate about. And so it's always difficult when I'm asked to speak to try to decide what I want to talk about, because I want to include everything that I know into one giant presentation, but I have to focus. So I'm focusing on this lean and agile stuff, particularly with an emphasis on the lean startup side. But I'm also a big Kanban nerd and really a big fan of using it as a technique for understanding your workflow and reducing waste in terms of your throughput. We were talking during the break about the relationship between lean and agile, and I thought the question that I got was really good, and so I wanted to kind of give the answer that I gave again here, just so that we're all on the same page. So for me, agile is really about delivery, efficient, fast, flexible delivery. And Lean is more sort of, it gives Agile a brain, right? So I think of Lean as being about sort of the enterprise's ability to deliver value in general. And Agile is kind of the engine underneath that lets us do it. And so, there's a sort of balancing act there. And I think it's kind of interesting. It's also worth noting that we're using these lean startup techniques for, in a lot of the cases I give, it's customer-facing product development. But it's also true that you can use this stuff for internal projects as well. So your customer, or a particular engineering team, may be another business unit or another department. That's very common. I'm working with a couple of large organizations right now that have projects like this, whether it's processing some kind of data more efficiently or whether it's doing a big systems integration. And we challenge them there to think about who their customer is for this big initiative, right? And to use personas and other kinds of customer development and lean startup techniques to make sure that the goals and the feature set and the success criteria are very clear in terms of business value for this other group that they're building this software for. So I want you to keep that in mind, that this isn't just about externally facing projects. You can use it really for anything. You can use it for not software as well. There's all kinds of projects that you can do user stories for, as we heard. You can use a visualization board. All this stuff is applicable well beyond the software world. So I think that teams are very important. It turns out that most good products are not built by single heroic individuals. I wrote a subtitle is about how great startup teams work, but I think a lot of the principles in here are about teams in general. So for me, I'm very much focused on the team as a unit, as a group, a collection of peers that are kind of in it together. So I want to talk about how we do team structure for these fast, nimble product teams. Right? So for me, I think that teams doing product development, and particularly digital products, need to have three properties. They have to be cross-functional. You need your engineers, designers, and product managers all working together in the team. You need to be dedicated to that product. And you need to be co-located. And not everybody can do that, and I understand, right? We get a lot of pushback on having all three of these things. I will just tell you that if all three of those things are present, that team will be exponentially faster and more effective at being the market than were any one of those things to be missing. That is just true from my experience. You have a question?
Yes, sir.
Sure.
Dedicated means in terms of their motivation or in terms that they are dedicated
Assignment.
only to this assignment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then I
That's what I
have
suspect.
more detail. Yeah. So dedicated to the team versus being assigned to 5 or 6 or 10 other projects. So we're going to get into that in a little bit. If you're missing one, it's okay. You'll be fine. You can still be lean and you can still be agile. I would argue that if you're missing 2, you're really sort of bleeding. And it's worth addressing that immediately if you want to get anything done that's valuable. So let's talk about what we mean here. So why cross-functional? This one's usually the easiest in this day and age to convince companies, clients, startups that I'm coaching to do. This general awareness that having design or UX, having product management, sort of business knowledge, and having engineering or feasibility or development, kind of all the 3 legs of that stool are really important. Cross-functional might also mean other people outside of that triad. Maybe it's other functions in the organization. The exception is, if you need to include sort of marketing, sales, legal, that sort of stuff, like they don't necessarily have to be dedicated to the project. So when I say dedicated, I'm thinking really of those core valuable, feasible, and usable people that are responsible for that. So the reason why cross-functional is important, and particularly in developing software, is because there are a lot of feedback loops that need to happen between the functions, right? So a designer designing an interface makes a lot of assumptions about designing the interface. And typically an engineer engineer can give really valuable feedback on those assumptions. And it's a lot easier to have them working together on a team rather than having your designers sort of off in a different silo. So I've worked with engineering teams, product teams that are made up of a product manager, a dozen or half a dozen engineers, and the designer that's assigned to the project is in a different building, responsible for providing design for 20 other projects, and it's slow, and it's painful, and it's inefficient. So for me, it's really important to have all three of those there, because the feedback loops, someone mentioned wait time being a factor in creating waste, the wait time between handoffs and between steps in the process. To reduce wait time, you want to collapse those feedback loops, and proximity in cross-functional teams is one of the ways to do that. So that's really important. Second one, why dedicated? For me, this one is really my sort of biggest sort of argument that I run around screaming about. It's very hard for me to be in an organization that's large and to make a case of why people that are assigned to a new product development team that we're running should be dedicated. It's sort of this idea that comes from really from Frederick Winslow Taylor and Gantt. This idea that you can sort of time slice people across projects and sort of treating people as if they were sharing time on a server or electrical utility rather than humans that have to do serious cognitive switching when you go from one project to another. So if there's one thing that I could change in all large organizations everywhere, is that people should be dedicated to a single initiative and get it done and ship it and then move on to another one, rather than having resources. I hate calling people resources, but resources spread across multiple things. At the end of the day, it really slows things down. So that's sort of one of my big ones. And then finally, co-located. Again, it's a matter of being able to collapse the time of feedback loops as tightly as possible. You want the team to be working together as a unit. It's better if they're all sitting together at a table like this, or at least on the same floor, or at least in the same building. It's very difficult to do product development that's cross-functional across multiple time zones. It is possible, and we have managed to develop lots of tools and processes like Slack and video chat and things like that for sort of coordinating. And as I said earlier, you can have 2 out of 3. I think for me, cross-functional is non-negotiable, but of co-located and dedicated, you have to sacrifice one, you can, but don't sacrifice the other. So if people are on multiple projects, they've got to at least be in the same room. Or, if they're not co-located, they have to be dedicated to the single project. But if you're missing those two, again, you're like exploding the amount of wait time, and so that's time to market. That's money that you're bleeding as you're waiting for the product to get done. So it's very important to do one or the other. All right, so this is not my favorite slide, but I thought it was interesting. This is just a function of, the bigger the teams get, the more communication connections you need to have. This is just like some math up here, but basically what it says is if you imagine, these 3 people on our team, each of them has a communication connection between them. As we add people, we exponentially increase the number of communication connections that have to happen for everybody to know what's going on. And yes, you can consolidate that by having sort of a single point of contact, who kind of communicates to everyone, hubs and spokes, but that only scales so far. So just in general, the principle of reducing the team size to that old 2 pizza size team, I think is pretty good. I've found that between 5 and 8 people is sort of an optimal size for a software delivery team. All right, let's talk about culture. So culture is a sort of weird, squishy word. We talk about it in a lot of different ways these days. I mean it in a particular way. It's mostly about the mindset in the organization. And so for me, the things that are important about it, are on a team. Everyone on the team needs to be values aligned, right? So values, again, it's another sort of squishy word, but I think it's important that the team be, everyone sort of embrace, what are we doing, what's the goal, what are the things that are important to us, whether it's transparency or fast feedback or detail-oriented, like whatever those properties are. That's something that we as a team want to kind of come to an agreement about early on in the process. It needs to be very clear what the vision and the strategy for the product is. And that is related to the cost of making important decisions on a project. So one of my favorite books on Lean is called Flow, Principles of Lean Product Development by a guy named Don Reinertsen. For me, it's the Lean Bible. Is that?
You should be in your history slide.
Yeah, and he is actually in the bibliography here. I reference him kind of heavily. One of the things that really struck me about Don's book is he has a whole chapter on building autonomous teams, right? So sometimes we talk about teams having autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Exactly where that comes from. Someone will know in the comments. The idea there is that there's actually, as Don says, there's a cost of delay of escalating decisions up a chain of command. And so the metaphor for our product team of being small, cross-functional, scrappy, and flexible is that once given a specific and clear goal, clear vision with a set of resources, like real resources like funding and tools and that sort of thing, and a set of constraints, sort of time or zone, or you're building for this particular market segment and not that one, you pretty much leave it up to the team to find their way there, right? Like you think of them as sort of a fast sort of tactical force out there in the wilderness finding their way to the goal. And there are some decisions that have to be escalated up the chain because they're big and affect a lot of things in an organization. But most decisions are not those, right? So I've been in a lot of startups or medium-sized organizations, or even probably not large ones, where the CEO is coming by and giving his opinion on UX decisions and that sort of thing. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, right? Like imagine having to being ready to deploy a new feature and having to wait for someone 3 levels up in the organization to tell you that this particular color of the button is good, right? So decisions have impact, and it's important for us to have teams that are prepared to move fast and potentially, break things within a realm of okay breakage, right? Like risk management notwithstanding. And that leads to that safe-to-fail experimentation principle. And I think that's probably, of these, I think that's one of the scariest but most important, is that a lot of what we talked about and a lot of the ideas behind Lean and Agile are iteration based on feedback. And so feedback means that in some way you've either made a mistake or you've omitted something. Right? Like maybe you haven't made a mistake, but you've omitted scope, and so you're going to put some more out there. Or you've actually built slightly the wrong thing, but you do it as small as possible so that you can make a mistake. Right? Both Lean and Agile have that in common, that you're using feedback to inform your process. That there's learning that's going on. When we did the personas, one person asked, why we come up with the problem statements ahead of time instead of going out into the world and just collecting problem statements for people. And it's actually a really important point, and I want to make sure that you guys get this. We're really coming from a place of the scientific method here, right? So the scientific method is important in that you declare a hypothesis about how the world works in advance. You state what you think is true. Then you devise an experiment to test that with real data. And if you're wrong, and you frequently are in science, you've learned something, right? Like you only learn something if you're wrong and you're surprised by the real result, right? Like that's how, neurons form, right? Like we think we know something, the world tells us something different, and then we're surprised, and then we adjust our worldview, and then we come up with another experiment. So the idea of doing the problem statements in advance is declaring what we think we know. Because it also turns out that humans are very good at convincing ourselves retrospectively that something we discovered out there we already knew. So this is like you're writing it down so that you're sure when you're wrong that you can show yourself that you were wrong and adjust your thinking, right? It's a process. So another slide on culture around how to do this. These are some basic things, but I think having working agreements at the beginning, so in team formation is very important and something that I see a little bit haphazard in larger organizations. I'm working with a bunch of teams right now where there are people that were there before, and there's new people that are added, and then people have to go on to another assignment, and they're kind of coming and going all the time. And I can't even imagine how they're able to keep it together, because for me, the beginning of a project is really all about getting the team together and deciding what are the success criteria, what are our values, what are our working agreements, and how that's all going to work. So for me, that's a really important step. We talked about retrospectives. I don't want to beat that drum too hard, but certainly having retrospectives is another feedback loop that encourages learning. What did we do wrong in our process? Oh, we're being too detailed in the acceptance criteria, so it's taking a lot of time and it turns out to not have that much value. We want to dial that back a little bit. Or we're not, we got this problem every time we try to deploy, we break something. So there are technical and non-technical things that come up in retros. But as you go through the retros, you evolve your process, and that's another feedback with learning. And this last one, I think, is also very critical. And it can be scary in some organizations that don't have sort of a history and a culture around this. But I think it's really important for people to be able to give each other on the team clear and direct and honest feedback. So on the side, one of the things that I do in my life that came completely not from technology is I've trained in conflict resolution. I've taken a couple of very intensive multi-day seminars in conflict resolution, just because it was interesting. And it's surprising how much that's come up in my working life, because one of the principles of conflict resolution that I learned is about active listening and communication, right? So for me, I think it's very important for people to be able to respectfully deliver feedback to each other so that we can all learn and grow, both as a team but also as professionals, right? So I think that feedback is very important. And so if an organization or a team doesn't have mechanisms for people to get honest feedback and give it to each other, it's really important to at least do that on your team, to have a way for people to have one-on-ones with each other and talk through issues. The retros are another form of being able to give honest feedback. So for me, those are really important. It also happens to be the case, by the way, that co-location encourages more honest and direct feedback in strange and interesting ways. So one of the things that happens when you all work in the same place is you end up doing a lot of non-work stuff together. You go to the lunchroom together, you're at the water cooler, you're in the elevator, maybe you go to drinks after work or something. And so those sort of social, non-work experiences create bonds of trust among humans. And trust is a really important aspect in communication, right? So when I'm working with teams that are together, I notice this phenomenon happening almost by itself. It makes it a lot easier for me as a coach. When the teams are split across time zones, I make sure that there's an opportunity, ideally at the beginning of the project, and then periodically thereafter, to get everyone together in the same physical space for a day or two, so that we can make some of those opportunities for bonding to happen, right? So a lot of this communication and making decisions together and being autonomous and cross-functional, a lot of it depends on trust. And trust is not something that you can just make happen. You have to create an environment and allow it to happen, and it happens over time. All right, so a little bit of the process. That's probably a pretty heavy title. This is more principles than like process, but we'll see where it goes. All right, so these are all more like process chunks or components or themes that I would nearly always include in any project. So customer development is sort of the first one. It's basically a part of or another name for Lean Startup. It's just basically the idea that you are treating the things that are in the product plan or the project plan as hypotheses before you treat them as sort of certainties or features or specifications. That we're going to decide as a group that we don't know everything this product should or can do, and what the user wants, and how to align those things. And so we're going to use experiments. We're going to go and interview people who are really actual customers, or as close as we can get, and we're going to use data to inform our decisions. This focus group comment here, I probably should explain that. In the Lean Startup sort of philosophy, many of us insist on doing one-on-one, or not one-on-one, sometimes you work in pairs, but one customer at a time interviews. And the reason for that is that focus groups tend to encourage groupthink, right? So you get a bunch of people together. It's okay for certain things. It's okay to take a finished product and get some market feedback from people. But if you're doing problem interviews and that really early stage stuff, you want to basically create a space for a single customer to get into detail about how they, how their life works and how their problems manifest and that sort of thing. You get a bunch of people together, you get a lot of nodding heads, and there's usually one personality that kind of takes over the room, and a lot of people are quiet, and it's very hard to facilitate. So I typically skip the multi-group testing. Another principle of the process is Kanban. So I really believe in Kanban. I don't think it's really Kanban versus Scrum. Like, you can do Scrum and Kanban together in many different and interesting ways. I'm focused on Kanban primarily because I think it's important. Its core principles are things that every team should be doing. So visualizing the work is really, really important. All the work should be visual, right? Like, Scrum teams have a Scrum board. That's a version of visualizing the work. Doing only one thing at a time is another tricky one for people in large organizations. Kanban has a principle of limited work in process, right? So the work step where people on the team are working on features, you try to keep that constrained to just as much as you can handle at one time. People don't multitask. Let me say that again. Right? Science has proven people don't multitask, right? Many of us think that we can and do, but there are reams of psychological data out there that show that people don't actually multitask, even if we think we do. So that manifests in product development. And so it's hard enough to focus on building the right product for a customer segment when you're out there in sort of the bloodbath of market competition. Why distract yourself further? Like, this stuff is tough, right? So we want to try to eliminate distractions as much as possible. And the measure of that, of how we're doing, is this thing with cycle time, which is the other sort of powerful concept in Kanban that I really like, which is really measuring the overall throughput of the value that we're delivering, not worrying about what Joe or Sally on the team is doing from one minute to the next, but actually watching the flow of work itself through the system. That's really your measure of success. Because if we want to get things to market fast, we need to be getting them through the system fast. And the best way to do that is to have a cross-functional team that are jumping around and helping each other, that kind of overlap in their skill sets. We're all working in the same room. We're working on one project. There's always something to do. It's not like you're going to find yourself twiddling your thumbs. If you're done with your inbox, you can go over to the next person down the process line and maybe pitch in there where things are getting blocked. So that, for me, there's a lot of concepts in Kanban. I don't have time to get into all the details. That's very, very powerful for speed and throughput. And most startups that I work with they're definitely doing this when I'm done with them. But a lot of times they're doing things like this without really realizing that that's Kanban, because they found that these are the things that work. Right? So focus is incredibly important. Another thing, I guess it's not really a thing to do. Well, yeah, I guess there are. So this cadence idea sort of goes with the throughput concept as well. So we do care about an overall flow of work through the system, trying to get value to the customer as quickly as possible so we can get feedback. But it's not always just a single flow with chaotic scheduling. It is important to establish cadences of checkpoints in discussion and communication, whether it's retros or planning meetings or that sort of thing. So I think most teams find that it's easier to still work in batches. It doesn't mean that you have to release everything in a batch. You can still do, if you can get to continuous deployment or continuous delivery, you should. Not everybody can, that's okay. But these cadences are there, right? Like, so having a daily stand-up is an important way to get a team that's working together just to check in quickly and make sure everybody knows what they're doing and they're not blocked. Having plannings on a regular basis, I have weekly here, that's sort of a placeholder for sprint. Having plannings where you have certain chunks of work that go together that we're all going to work on together for this week or this month, this sprint, that's typically pretty common and very important to have those check-ins. And then finally having retrospectives at some periodicity that allows us to adjust our process. So there's cadences to the work as well. And then tracking progress. So this one's kind of interesting for Agile teams that are experienced that I've talked to about Lean Startup. There's sort of this question of sort of user stories versus experiments. The way that I think about this work is that, like the same way that I said that sort of Lean puts a brain on Agile, you've got this overall sort of market direction that your project is going in. And I think the work is organizing experiments from a customer value perspective. But in order to actually implement the experiment, you usually have to break it up into tasks. So typically, I somewhat swap out epics for experiments. I think they kind of exist at the same level, right? So an epic could maybe be just sort of retooled as an experiment, a thing that we need to learn about the customer this week or this month or whatever the duration of the experiment is. And to build the experiment itself, which is going to typically be a piece of software or a product component, we need to break that into tasks like usual and have our usual user stories that we would compile together to ship this experiment, and then you're running the experiment and testing the results of it, right? So we're measuring both speed and learning. And what I mean by that specifically is that the speed is the team's ability to deliver. So that's sometimes referred to as velocity if you're using Scrum and story points. I tend to use cycle time. I think it's better, more accurate, and you don't have to haggle over estimates. But basically, there's a sort of metric of throughput, passing work out the door. But then you've got, well, what happens after it's shipped? What is the user doing with it? Are we getting more signups? Are we earning more revenue? What were the metrics for the experiment? So that's the learning part. And you're doing both of those together. And in your retros, you're optimizing for improving both of those metrics. Because at the end of the day, you want to be nailing exactly what the customers want so that they're giving you their money for your wonderful solution, and you want to do it as fast as possible. And ideally, you want to do it faster than the 25 startups that are out there also going for that market share that are coming for your lunch money. So that's why the speed is important. So I spend a lot of my days and sometimes nights trying to help large organizations that are frankly living in fear of disruption from the valley, from smaller upstarts that are unbundling and decoupling all their offerings, trying to teach them how to move faster and capture that market share as if they were a startup. It's not easy, but it's definitely possible. All right, let's have another exercise. It's lots of fun. Okay, we're going to do one more exercise before we're done. I promise you it won't be that painful. So I want you to break into pairs. Can you do that? Identify your pair, and then I'll tell you what to do. Oh, and you need your persona on you. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're just going to practice a problem interview. It's very easy. And I just want you to mock this out. Okay, so imagine, we're going to take turns. Imagine for the moment that you are either a startup founder or the sort of key person who is working on a new product for a company, and you're out there in the world performing customer development, like a good, lean startup advocate. And so you have managed to schedule the person who's sitting with you for a customer interview. And what I want you to do is I want you to take your persona and look at your persona and basically interview the person that you're sitting with in terms of learning how similar that person is to the persona properties that you have. And just do it in the order that you created them, and at the end, what you want to do is you want to find out if the problems that you have listed on your persona, if this person actually has those problems. And if they do, how painful of a problem is it really? Okay? Does that make sense? Any questions? Yes? Okay, so here's what we're practice a problem interview. You're going to ask them questions about themselves. You're going to compare it to
What I'm trying to do is find out how similar you are. So, what's the name? Do you live in the local area? So, this So this person was working in City Hall, which the thing is, what they do, lots of people, officially, city and state, and unofficially,
I want to hear from you guys about the experience. Okay, so how was that for you, that little mock interview? How did you feel about it? Easy?
Yeah, simple conversation.
Okay, good. Did you learn anything new?
I learned
Any
about,
surprises?
we learned about each other's specific issues that are not so much fucking the knowledge, behind your slide set, but the culture of our organization.
Sure, okay. And in terms of the persona, the problems, was there any surprises? Was there anything like, oh no, that's not really a problem? Or did you nail it? Like, did you get 100%?
Well, for me, I think the problems that I have listed touched on a few.
So there were some similarities. What about another table? I want to hear from folks about the experience. Yes.
I didn't nail it because my assumption was one thing, and then what he came up with was, oh no, it was all about patterns and BI and predictive analysis. And I said, whoa, that wasn't what I was expecting. Yeah, but it was really cool.
Any other reactions to the exercise? Yes.
Just one observation I had is that you had to be really conscious to not be leading too much to what you were looking for. You wanted to just keep real general in case something popped up, you were thinking about.
Yeah, definitely. That's one that comes up a lot. Yeah, absolutely. Any other sort of thoughts or experiences that you want to share? Is it you? Yeah.
In my case, I found very interesting that basically all the problems that I wrote in this side, it was exactly what she was describing in this side.
Right.
And I think it's because it was very, I asked the right questions. Basically, I was getting the answers for the things that I already thought it was the program.
Okay, so you got some validation. Okay, great. All right, so I just wanted you guys to have that experience. These problem interviews I have teams do all the time. It's one of the sort of early experiments that we run. They have to go out and do it with strangers. It's scary for some of them. Introverts and extroverts alike, actually. And so it's one of the fun parts of my job, is having people go out and interview strangers. And, I coach them through it, but it's a little weird at first. But it's just another example of going out and validating your assumptions with people who are your proposed customers. All right, so I only got a couple more. I'm going to try to breeze through these so we can get out of here in a reasonable amount of time. I want to talk about how companies are blending lean and agile in a sort of programmatic or strategic way. A couple of sort of models that I can give you. Sorry, lots of words. I will definitely summarize for you. So basically, the three kind of main patterns that I've found organizations doing this are to nest lean startup tactics inside of an existing agile process. So there's already a team that's doing agile, and they discover a lean way of thinking, they discover lean startup and customer development, they want to integrate it in some way. What they'll do often is to try to kind of turn their existing user stories into experiments. It can be a little bit muddy when you do that, but people are definitely trying. There have been some successes in sort of doing that lean after the fact. A slightly more successful way for me that I've seen is nesting agile inside of a lean startup loop. So it's sort of the reverse, right? So you start with sort of the experiments. That's the way I described it. The experiments being your sort of epic layer. And then as you're executing the experiments, it's an agile process to execute them. And that works pretty well. There is also this sort of dual track or discovery, delivery, kind of having different teams that are responsible for different parts of the process. So you might have teams that are doing rapid experimentation, building MVPs, kind of operating as your kind of startup-like team out doing new product development, and they're validating things, and then they sort of hand it over to delivery teams that then scale the successes. That also is challenging. It can work. A lot of people are trying this third method, and none of these three work perfectly, so this is not a solved problem, right? The problem with the third approach is typically that handing off something that is successful in the market to a different team to then take stewardship over. You lose a lot of knowledge that the team originally built up about the market and the customer. There's some risk there. Again, companies do try this, and sometimes it works. So you may already be doing one or more of these models. It's entirely possible. And so just as an example, not necessarily a plug, though it sort of is, but I really meant it as an example. The way that I've been doing this most recently is in taking a team that's mixed internal people and startup experienced folks from out in the world and putting them together for a period of time on a product, doing it in a space that's outside of the usual facilities, and basically treating them as much as possible like an actual startup. And then what comes out of the other end is some kind of working digital product that may or may not be what the company wants in their portfolio, but something will get built. And then again, you still have that question of, well, what happens after that product comes out? Do you then hand it back to a more sort of operational team in the mothership to kind of scale? My preference, honestly, is to keep that team together and kind of treat it as a separate new nascent unit and allow it to scale in the same way that a startup would scale. So you don't lose that knowledge. But it's a decision to be made, right? So every organization is going to have a different but that's kind of, a couple of different ways of thinking about how to mix lean and lean startup techniques with Agile. And with that, I think we're pretty much at the end here, but I'd love to hear if anybody has any questions. Yes?
I'd love to hear a story or two about some of your Blackwillow successes.
Sure. So it's difficult because we're very early stage. So a lot of the work that we're doing right now is kind of leading up to this incubator model. But the model is based on work that I've done previously at other places. So when we were working at NEO, which I said was a sort of digital consulting agency, we worked a lot very similar to that method. That's a lot of where I got this sort of methodology from. So we would do projects. We did projects for a large auto manufacturer that may or may not have been mentioned in one of my slides, that had us doing some product development for them. They know how to make cars really well. They're not really so sharp on digital product development. They had sort of digital experiences that they wanted to test, and so things were done like hacking together a tablet and basically mocking it out as if it were the onboard system and going and finding customers to come and try it out, right? So we had NEO engineers that were working with product managers from the company, and they would come to our office in San Francisco. That was this hip sort of startup workspace, so that they're kind of soaking in the culture as well. And we would literally go and pull people off the street on Market Street and have them come in and sit down at this dummy dashboard from the car and have them do experiments and stuff like that. So that's one example. Another example that was kind of interesting was for a large retailer. They are a sort of department store. They have a big online presence. They all shop there. They are having trouble getting millennial shoppers because they've been around for a long time, and millennials aren't really going there so much. And so our team put together a designer and engineer from our side and product folks from their side, and we formed a cross-functional team. And in 12 weeks, we went from no idea at all what to do and worked our way through to, in 90 days, building a digital user experience on the phone that used sort of cool style influencers out in the world to kind of promote products and have this whole kind of content experience. That's not something they would have normally come up with on their own. It was that collaboration between sort of these outside entrepreneurial folks who were working on their problems with their knowledge and research and their data. So for me, I think one of the things that's interesting about that model is that the entrepreneurs out in the field, and a lot of companies are trying to do this to build bridges with the startup community. The entrepreneurs have this kind of experience that I'm describing to you. Whether they adhere strictly to this particular philosophy or kind of just do things like this naturally, they're out there doing customer development all the time anyway. They know how to build things quickly. They don't have access to big and interesting problems and large data sets and resources as a startup. So it's very attractive for them to partner with large organizations because they can solve bigger problems than they otherwise have access to. And for the company, they get access to the sort of talent and creativity that's also very difficult for them to have access to. So those are some examples of how to do this kind of product development. And I think it's important to keep in mind that each of these initiatives of building a sort of a minimal viable product in a short time period, the whole thing is still an experiment. Right? So we're not like, oh, we're going to build the next perfect online dashboard experience. And it's like, this might be a way for us to develop a new business model or a new revenue stream, of which we probably have a portfolio of 10 or 20 possible ideas. And you could have 10 or 20 possible teams all working on those different ideas, using these techniques. And it's as if each one is its own little mini startup. And so you sort of pick whichever ones work out, whichever ones can come back with the market data to show that there's a there, and that it actually fits in with the overall strategy of the organization. Any other questions?
What are the two key challenges that you typically face for a new startup? they want to adopt this methodology?
The two key challenges. I think that one of the toughest things is the gap between having a clear vision and working in an iterative way. So one of the sort of the tensions or paradoxes you find in trying to do this is that you can't really just do iteration without a North Star, without a direction, because you're just going to kind of iterate all over the place. Like a directionless pivot doesn't really get you anywhere. So while it's like Lean Startup came along and said, look, it's not a good idea to have this grand vision that's super detailed and just build toward it until you're done without testing it. We know that doesn't work. But there's been a sort of a pendulum swing the other way, that teams are just doing customer development and being really scrappy without a clear vision of what impact they want to have in the world. And so you really do need both. So that's one challenge, is the balancing act between those two pieces. I think the other challenge that's also really difficult for teams, and this is true whether it's a true sort of independent startup or sort of a startup-like team in a large organization, is focus. Because there's always an infinite number of things you could be doing. There's an infinite number of experiments that you could be running. And so prioritization of experiments is a really, really tricky problem. You know, I have some methods that I use to help teams deal with this. There's a number of us in my colleagues who are working on various quantitative methods to try to identify the next riskiest assumption that you should test first. But that's a really tough problem. It's not an easy problem to solve. So it's very easy for teams to get distracted. I'll give you a third one, even though you didn't ask for it. A lot of times there's a temptation to latch on to one big customer or one big client at the expense of all of the rest of the market. And the problem with that is those clients exert an enormous amount of gravity on the direction of the product. The product roadmap tends to bend towards that client's particular needs. And next thing you know, you're consulting. You're just developing a custom solution for this client, and you're no longer pursuing this broader vision. So it's difficult for teams that are strapped for revenue and they land that big deal and they're very excited about it. But if that's all they've got, they end up basically attaching like a little lamprey to this one giant corporate client, and they're never able to kind of break free, because now you're trying to make this decision of, well, we've got this safe account, we should just continue to churn out the features they're asking for. That's no longer a Lean Startup. You're just sort of a custom team. That's a third challenge that's very hard for teams. Yes?
So how do you deal with changes? I mean, I had this question before, that what do you do in an agile environment when the customer or the product manager decides that throw everything away and you are almost to demo out something. Throw out everything, start all over again.
Mm-hmm.
So does this happen often?
Yeah, all the time. Mm-hmm. I think that the key is to use data, use evidence to make those kinds of decisions. Mm-hmm. So if you're in a situation where you're almost done working on something and the product manager comes in and tells you to throw it all away and change direction, that would definitely be a cultural anti-pattern. Like, that's not something we want to see in the first place, because typically something was missed, or something was wrong, or we're not working off the same data set, right? So usually what you end up doing with the process is you use the process as a way of externalizing the decisions. So like everybody's kind of looking at the same data and we sort of make the decision together, versus sort of a top-down, like the product manager knows the best solution and is telling you what to do. So that sort of gets at that team autonomy. But you can only have that team autonomy if everyone on the team is sort of, you know, has a certain level of maturity and is treated with respect and treats each other with respect, and you have good communication skills, and you're using data to inform your decisions and having regular retrospectives, then you can operate in that way. I think there's probably, if you took an existing team and tried to apply all these things, you would have to do it gradually. Like Like you have to introduce like a few things at a time to kind of get them to that level of maturity. But I think that, you know, more mature, established, flexible teams deal with change more easily than teams that are sort of, you know, nascent and don't really have a clear direction or process yet. You know, change is very impactful on a team that's very rigid or doesn't have a good sort of event horizon of what's coming next. Like that, when things take them by surprise and it fractures the team, it can be very damaging.
It would be, that's fine.
Sure.
Yes.
Is it because of the tacit knowledge that you will have? You know, the more mature teams will be adaptive to changes quickly?
Yeah, that's one component. So the tacit knowledge is really important. You should, as you're building customer empathy and you're building an understanding of the features, you know, that can't all be written down in documentation when you're carrying around a lot in your head. The other side also is just the fluidity with which the teamwork happens, so that those soft skills, the trust and communication between the team is sort of the other half, right? So those two things come together to make a really effective and efficient team.
I have one question. In your experience with 6 startups, how often did you come across organizational depth, as in, you know, change of behavior or change of attitude, and how big was that and how did you overcome?
Well, did you say organizational debt?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I think it was fairly frequent. It's worth, you know, giving the stats that of the 6 startups that I referred to, you know, 3 were catastrophic failures, you know, smoking craters that a lot of, you know, blood, sweat, tears, and emotion went into. The other 3 were reasonably successful, sort of. One is still around, another was acquired, you know, so there's a balance. None of them were, you know, over the moon unicorn, you know, you already know that I was in that, right? But I think that all of them had to go through various kinds of pivots and changes in interacting with the market. They all made some significant business model change at some point, at least one. All of them did. You know, and that was usually based on, you know, pursuing some direction and running into a wall and having to adjust. And in those cases where we had to adjust, not everybody stuck around, right? Like sometimes that happens, right? So at least one has changed, that's still around, has changed its whole business model because we identified a flaw so the business model that allowed it to scale to a certain point plateaued out, and the change that they needed to make to keep going was a level of automation that required getting rid of a whole chunk of people that had been hired to do that first business model, right? So and I wasn't there at the time, but I could, you know, have been following. That definitely happens, right? So there are these sort of different stages of maturity, and not everybody's going to stick around for each stage. There's also people who are really good at the early stage that don't really care for being in a really large, successful organization. You know, like I'm one of them. I mean, I like working with large, successful organizations, but not as an employee, right? Like as a coach, as a consultant. But you know, there are some of us who are just more suited to the scrappier, more risky early stage, and other people that are more comfortable in a kind of a stable, more operational environment. That's also, like, people will come and go from different initiatives depending on how it progresses. Yeah. Are we out of time? Any other questions?
Any last questions?
Time to go home. All right, cool.
All right, incredible,
Thanks,
incredible content. I love the way you spoke about the decision-making and pivoting, but with the direction. I mean, that was really making, you know, taking the decision tree in the third dimension. I love it. Thank you so much. So with that, I would definitely like to have you, you know, put something on the retrospective of what you liked in this meetup, along with the speaker. What kind of other topics would you like to hear about. What do you want us to do more? What do you want us to do less? So definitely like to hear from you on that one. So if you see the Starfish retrospective right there. Along with that, we learned a lot. I learned a lot personally. So I'm going to have my own sticky notes on that takeaways. And if you're like me, please contribute your takeaways over there.